Hello again, everyone. It's good to see you for another one of our webinars. We're glad, as always, that you can join us. And we are very happy this afternoon to have Father Doug May leading us in this webinar. And just a little overview of Father Doug and his mission ministry. Father Doug has been a Maryknoll missionary, a priest working for well over 20 years approximately in Egypt, where among the many ministries he was involved in, Father Doug taught at the Coptic Catholic seminary outside of Cairo in Mahdi, Egypt. By the way, Father Doug is also a Coptic Catholic priest and has faculties to celebrate Mass and services in that particular rite, along with his own native rite of being a Roman Catholic priest. Father Doug also was in the Middle East 2 years in the Emirates, working there. So well over 22 years in the Middle East. In addition, Father Doug has worked for 3 years with Maryknoll in Kenya. And among the many ministries and achievements that he has been involved with, Father Doug was very instrumental in building the handicapped home. I believe it's Our Lady Queen of Peace handicapped home in Kenya, and wonderful home now for handicapped individuals, particularly children. That's been going very well. And then, in addition to his overseas mission work, Father Doug spent 12 years with our CED department working in the U.S. on mission education, promotion, vocations work, helping out in that way, meeting many people. And I'm happy to say that Father Doug is from the great diocese of Buffalo, New York, which is my home diocese as well. And we welcome Father Doug, and we look forward to your many insights on the Middle East, Maryknoll's involvement there, but also the current situation in that part of the world. But I now turn it over to you, Father Doug, and if you could lead us in prayer, and we'll go from there.
You've probably heard, the Our Father in Spanish. You may have heard it in German or French. But since I'm going to hog it, I'm going to basically do the Our Father in Arabic with the with the sign of the cross. Okay. So Bismillah wal Ibn wa Ruh al Qudus Allah al Wahid. Ameen. Ya Aban Ladhi fi Samawat liyataqaddas ismuk liyati malakutuk litakun mashiatuk kama fi samai kadhalika al ard khubzana kafafana a'tina al yom واغفر لنا ذنوبنا كما نغفر نحن أيضا لمذنبين إلينا ولا تدخلنا في التجربة لكن نجنا من الشرير بالمسيح يسوع ربنا لأن لك الملك والقوة والمجد إلى الأبد آمين بسم الله والابن والروح القدس الله الواحد آمين. Okay, so that's the Our Father in Arabic with the sign of the cross. What I hope to do, I'd like to leave a lot of it up to discussion and questions and answers, because I'd like to think that maybe you have questions and answers, because at least in terms of Maryknoll, since 1999, I was the only Maryknoller working in the Middle East. We had a thing called the Middle East Unit back in the started out as the Arab Muslim Unit in Yemen, and then it went to being the Middle East Unit in Egypt, and then it evolved into me being there as part of Africa between 1999 and 2015. One little correction, no offense, Paul, but Our Lady Queen of Peace was a project for special needs in Cairo that I got involved in 1999, and it's been operating since it opened in 2004. It was St. Teresa Development Center in the Rift Valley in Kenya. So maybe you kind of mixed the two of them up. One of the things I always say is, from an academic point of view, I am sure not an expert. From an experiential and from an exposure point of view, with 22 years over there, I'd like to think between my Egyptian and Arab connections and my NGO, non-government organization connections, my embassy connections, my multinational connections, along with all my local connections, between being part of something or watching it or listening to it. I've got a fair amount of background. I don't tend to try to speak authoritatively. It's going to be mainly my opinions from my experience and the different encounters I've had with people. And occasionally, if you ask, especially if you said, well, how do they look at it? I will actually try to give you, at least to some degree, what their opinions would be on it, mainly Egyptians. My background in terms of working, as Paul mentioned, in my former life, I worked in hotel management in Sharjah, next to Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. After that, I actually rediscovered my Christianity and my Catholicism because I'd left the church before I went over there, way back in my Air Force days in 1969, 70. I'd gone through a few crises, including losing a cousin in Vietnam. And so by 1971, I'd said, "Khalas, that's forget it. No more church, no more Catholicism, no more nothing." But I was mentored a lot by my family. My dad owned his own business, and I was a labor relations major in college. And so just briefly, when I went to the Emirates, I had a mixture of Christians, Muslims, and Hindus from various countries in Asia, in Egypt, who basically kept telling me that I was one of the better Christians I'd ever met. And it was based not on what I did in terms of going to church or what I believed in terms of dogmas, but almost any person anywhere in the world now kind of knows the teachings of Jesus, at least what we're supposed to be professing. And so when I'd say, "I don't know what you mean by being a good Christian," their comment was, "Well, Jesus taught his disciples that they were supposed to love one another, even their enemies, and you're one of the first Christians we've ever met that seems to act like he respects, cares for, and loves us. You're a good Christian." And so it was some of my Indian employees that came from Catholic areas in Madras, Mangalore, Bangalore, Goa, Kerala, in India that actually started working on me to go to Mass. And I eventually gave into them and not only rediscovered my Catholicism and Christianity, but discovered a vocation, which I thought I'd given up on a long time ago. And so anyway, when I joined Maryknoll in 1979, I had just come back from the Emirates in January of 79, and basically was very interested in Middle East. I found out at that time that Maryknoll was in Yemen, and they were in the Sudan, which is really considered Middle Eastern, but it's Arab Muslim, and at least the northern Sudan is. And so basically, when the option came as a student for overseas training, originally they were talking about sending us to Yemen, and that went belly up because they lost their sponsorship with Catholic Relief Services in Yemen. And then they were talking about sending us for language school in Beirut, and that was still during the Civil War, because we're talking about 1982, and the Civil War in Lebanon didn't end until around 1990. So we actually ended up by going to Rome and studying Arabic and Islamics at the Pontifical Institute for Arab Islamic Studies in Rome for a year, and then after that I went down to Egypt. One of the reasons why I've titled it Life, Love, and Legacy, reflecting on my life and experiences in Egypt, was partly because basically I experienced it in the sense of I wiped out in 2002 with a bicycle accident and was pretty well racked up. I'm still suffering from some of those issues because of a bone infection, but I really experienced a lot of TLC, tender loving care, from a whole different group of people. And so, I mean, it wasn't just, a job. It really got involved. And I maybe shouldn't say this, but I'm in a truthful moment, but in let me think, I have to think now, 1998, we had the same Superior General, Ray Finch, as we have now. And I was informed by him that the Middle East unit was closing. And we got into it a little bit heavily. And I said, now look it, you told me to enculturate, I enculturated. You told me to learn the language. I did the best I could at learning the language. And you told me to love the people. And the worst part is they love me back. And now you're telling me I'm not going to go back. So we kind of played a rough game of poker. I finally ended up by resigning from the society, or at least I put in my letter. And finally, they said, look, you're being stubborn, but since Egypt is at the northeastern corner of Africa, we're going to agree that if you join the African region, we'll let you go back to Egypt. So just a chronology, I was there from 1982 to 1985 as a seminarian. From 1986 through 1991 as a priest the first time, and then I went back from 1999 to 2008. And then after my 4 years, not 3 years in Kenya, I went back again from 2012 to 2015. So I think that adds up to around 20 years. One of the things is when it comes to the legacy, having been part of the Coptic Catholic Seminary formation education for 10 years, I really feel that that's probably some of the guys that was involved in their formation education. I think in a way that's my biggest legacy. My whole title for ministry, in a way, for my presence in Egypt, especially after I went back on my own in 1999, obviously we didn't have a group. So I kind of titled my ministry, Helping Egyptians Help Egypt. So my whole idea was trying to form, educate, encourage, challenge, whatever, Egyptians to do what they could to help Egypt. And I would be their support mechanism, spiritually, financially, emotionally, whatever. I didn't try to do anything strictly on my own. Nothing has my name on it. One or two things have my picture around somewhere, but it's been a really rewarding thing. You know, I don't know if Christy will put it up or not, but I got involved with one of my seminarians who's been involved in team ministry, prison ministry, with another Catholic priest who was one of my students and spiritual directees. And they do team ministry with a Muslim sheikh, now 2 Muslim sheikhs, Abdul Rahman, Mahmoud Goma. And they also, when they're not doing prison ministry as a team, the Muslims and the Christians, when we have sectarian violence in Minya, and Minya is one of the most violent governorates or states in Egypt, they basically demonstrate showing solidarity with one another, trying to get Egyptians to see that even if they don't agree with one another, even if they don't necessarily approve of each other, that they need to listen to each other, to try to understand each other, respect each other, and learn how to live together and get along and not be at odds with each other. And so that was one of the things at the seminary. 3 of my former students are bishops. One just came back from being the second secretary for Pope Francis and is Arabic Italian translator. You know, so those are kind of like, I used to call them my nephews, but after finding out that Theodore McCarrick was using the word Uncle Ted, and I used to use the word, there's some of them still call me Yama Douglas, which is Uncle Doug. After the Theodore McCarrick thing, I said enough of the Uncle Doug and or you know, you being my nephews. I don't think that's a term I should use anymore. When Paul mentioned the home for the handicapped, that was in partnership with a priest friend of mine I'd known since I was a seminarian at the seminary. It's not affiliated, but it's modeled on the Jean Vanier Faith and Light for Special Needs. And again, it's Our Lady Queen of Peace, or Our Lady of Peace Home for Special Needs. We opened it, like I mentioned, in 2004, and 15 years later, or 16 now, it's still functioning. It had a few ups and downs and bumpy roads along the way, but we seem to have straightened those out. Partly because, you know, I was the only native English-speaking priest in the country since '99. I got involved in offering English masses on the weekends. I lived at the seminary for a good 9 years out of the 20, or 10 years actually, counting my seminary time there. And, you know, they had enough priests to cover the weekends. They haven't yet experienced a vocation shortage. So I basically said, well, you know, since I'm a native English speaker, I'll function with the expatriate community. So I used to offer masses in English at 3 different churches, usually 1 or 2, but sometimes at 3, in downtown Cairo and also in Mahdi, which is a suburb where the seminary was located. And in that, I had 22 nationalities that spoke English as a first, second, or third language. And basically, they were people from the US government, from other governments, embassies, everything from an ambassador down to a clerk. A lot of NGOs like Catholic Relief Services and Caritas, let me think, CARE, and a few other NGOs, non-government organizations, as well as, you know, some multinationals. I mean, I had people that were, you know, like Coca-Cola or the Koreans that were Hyundai or whatever. And so one of the reasons why I bring that up is for the fact that not only from my experience, which would have been the 20 years in Egypt, which included 2, spending time with the peacekeeping forces in Sinai, being in Jerusalem during the first Gulf War in '91, and meeting a lot of the people over there and talking to them. If I start making comments, a lot of my sources, I would like to think, kind of know as much or more than I would know. And if I found that 2 or 3 different sources from different directions, political or whatever, religious, seem to coincide, then I'd say, well, the factual element of this is probably fairly high. Another thing I had was this last term I had there for 3 years. For about 1.5 years, I worked with the Center for Arab West Understanding, which was a Dutch NGO that tried to promote a better understanding by challenging inflammatory and erroneous articles in various periodicals, either online or in magazines or newspapers. We didn't always succeed, but we tried. And that was a very good cross-section of Egyptians in terms of Muslim and Christian, everything from secular Muslim to Brotherhood, because this was around the time that we were electing the Brotherhood and Morsi to be the president back in 2012 to 2013. Being there for the second revolution, because I was in Kenya for the first revolution. I still make a trip back every year for about a month. And this year the trip went belly up because of the pandemic. I just got off the phone though with a couple of my Egyptian friends in the last 2 or 3 hours, and a couple more calls in the last week or so. But that's kind of the introduction. And this obviously is not Egypt, but it's a stained glass window, if you can make it out, of the Holy Family in exile. And it's actually in the Lady Chapel at Maryknoll. And the stained glass windows in that chapel are actually the 7 Sorrows of Mary. But I thought to myself, when I go down for morning and evening prayer, I'm the only missionary who's got his own window. And the other thing too is just the fact that even I think some of the readings we had today for the morning prayer, Egypt is so often brought up in the scriptures, especially in the Hebrew scriptures, and to some degree, you know, when it comes to the exodus of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, the Holy Land, going from Israel, Palestine into Egypt. And, you know, one of the things I always like to get into too is you don't go to Egypt to bring Jesus, okay? It's one of the oldest churches in the world, of which is majority now Coptic Orthodox, very small minority that is Coptic Catholic, and 5 other Eastern rites, as well as the Latin Roman Catholic rite. You go there basically to support Christians staying Christian and Christians staying in Egypt, because there's a huge exodus of Christians for economic and discriminatory reasons. But you basically do everything you can to support them in their identity and in their position. It's one of the larger Christian majorities in the Arab Muslim world. Now, this is where you could get into some fairly strong arguments about numbers. the population of Egypt is about 110 million, give or take. And very often what they do is they apply a 10% rule to the population, which means there's probably around 11 million Christians. I would dispute that to some degree, because what's happened since the 50s, because in the 1950s, after the overthrow of King Farouk, you had a short period with Mohammed Naguib as president. Then you had Gamal Abdel Nasser until I think it was around 1970 or so, 70, I think it was 70, 72. But anyway, it was a very secular country, and Christians, you know, were very much at home in Egypt. They felt accepted in Egypt, maybe a little bit, and you know, the Muslims might have even been a little bit envious of them, because King Farouk and Nasser did not get into discrimination very much. Some Egyptian Christians complained that, for instance, Nasser took their land, but it was part of the socialization of Egypt, or because there were some fairly rich Christian landowners that owned a lot of farmland in Upper Egypt. But the big thing is Anwar Sadat, when he took over, and this is something I actually edited a book on, changed a definite, an indefinite to a definite article in Article 2 of the Egyptian Constitution, which began the beginning of the end of Egypt being a secular country. And so Egypt has become more and more Islamicized since Sadat's time. It kind of drifted in that direction during Mubarak's time. It was going dangerously too far in that direction during Mohammed Morsi's time, but he only lasted a year. And it's kind of drifting in the same direction like Mubarak's time with Sisi. One of the biggest problems is Sisi is considered to be, and this is something unique in the Middle East, Christians, minorities in general, but Christians specifically, seem to prefer dictators, whether it's Saddam Hussein or Assad in Syria or Mubarak in Egypt, because their concept of democracy is that the majority, when they win an election, has no obligation or responsibility to protect the rights of minorities, where dictators sometimes cater to minorities as a support group. So Egyptians, Christians feel somewhat threatened in Egypt with quote unquote democratic elections. For the other thing is, they understand democracy as being an election with more than one candidate. It's not how you govern, but how you get elected. And hopefully we all realize that there's a lot more to democracy than just an election, even though that's an essential part of it. This is Jehen, and Jehen is an interesting character. She is a Muslim, but we had her for a language teacher between 1982 and 1985. She's been a friend ever since, and we somehow impressed her because she actually came and studied at Maryknoll School of Theology between 1990 and 1991 as a Muslim studying Christian theology as well as feminist studies at Maryknoll School of Theology. And we've been friends now for going close to 40 years. And she's one of the ones that keeps me up to date. She's also one that's got very strong opinions. She's got a doctorate in English Lit. We had a group, Pax Christi International. They came to Egypt and with Marie Dennis, and I took them around different places. At that time I was working for the Center for Arab West Understanding, and I'd gone to a meeting of theirs in Amman, Jordan, you know, just not too long before that. So anyway, everybody was giving Pax Christi International the same spiel, and I knew Jehen had a very strong opposing position. So the very last night we got together at one of the hotels, and I gave Jehen her chance to give the spiel, and it was nice because it balanced out. She was not in favor, for instance, of the first revolution, and because she felt it was just going to go into chaos. That's another discussion we could get into. But she has a phenomenal personality. She has got she's a strong woman. She's a 20-year breast cancer survivor. When I had my accident, because when she had her cancer, we basically looked at each other and said, we're going to laugh our way through your cancer. When I had my bone infection, she said the same thing to me. We're going to laugh through your bone infection, which lasted until just recently. But she's very knowledgeable. I don't know if she's going to be tuning into this at all, but if you need an opinion, she'll give it to you because she's not shy at all. One of the things I always bring up, as Paul mentioned, I'm Coptic Rite Catholic, but this is actually an Armenian Catholic priest. That's not his wife. That's a common friend of ours. But in most of the Eastern Rite churches, and all of them in Egypt, there's an option to be married before you get ordained. So Gerard, who's Armenian, is married with 2 kids. Unfortunately, due to ongoing illnesses, he just passed away about 3 or 4 months ago. But he and I have been good buddies ever since 1986 or 87, not long after I got ordained. And, one of the things that's interesting is the way, and we can get into that one if you ever want to, the way the Eastern Church, both Catholic and Orthodox, looks at celibate priesthood versus married priesthood. And where the Catholic Church does not encourage marriage among their priests because it's obviously easier to move them around and it's less of an economic issue to have celibate priests without families. In the Orthodox Church, for what it's worth, it's mandatory marriage before you can be ordained a parish priest, because celibacy is just considered to be a monastic vocation and not a clerical vocation. Gina is another one of my friends. That's the one he's got his arm around. And she's like Jehen. They're actually both post-polio. And Gina worked at the American Embassy for over 20 years. And her specialty was computers. But she, again, is a very outspoken Christian versus Jehen being an outspoken Muslim. And anyway, every time I want to try to update my information, I usually ask the 2 of them because they provide a nice balance between opinions. One thing most people think of when they think of Egypt, obviously, are camels and pyramids. I've never ridden a camel to this day. And this is not one of the 3 Giza pyramids. And actually, there are over 30 pyramids in that area. This is in Dashur, and this is actually the pyramid. It's one of the oldest. And it actually goes up to a certain degree, and then when they realized it could either collapse or it would go too high, they changed the angle. And this is across from a friend of mine's property, and it's amazing because on one side you have the Nile irrigation water, and you've got like almost 100 date palms, and you've got like the bougainvilleas, like the flowers there. And on the other side of the road, it's just the desert, just like a line went right down the road. And it just basically gives you that sense of history, because this being the oldest one, that pyramid's somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 years old, most people think. An interesting thing too, living in Madi, which is a suburb of Cairo on the south side, is you had a fair number of educators living out there, including American University Cairo professors, and one was Kent Weeks, who up until recently you could see on either the Discovery Channel or the History Channel, because he was one of the top Egyptian, or top American, I should say, Egyptologists. He has been on, well, I think he's left Egypt now because his wife died a couple of years ago. But when he was on the dig, he was on the dig for almost 40 years. He started in 1963, and he was still going strong in 2003. This is the Coptic Rite Catholic Seminary. It was built in the 50s. It has that Italian look to it. It's a beautiful building. When I was there at its peak, we had over 60 seminarians from all over Egypt. Right now, according to the statistics I got yesterday from an Egyptian priest, they're down to about 30. So they are getting hit a little bit when it comes to vocations. I spent, like I said, 10 years of my time there. I loved gardening before I got hurt. And so a lot of that, the grounds, including the close area you see, was stuff that I did back in my time when I was healthy and loved gardening. Okay, this is the class. This is one of the lecture halls. And one of the things I used to do, because I got a housing allowance and I wasn't using it because I'm living at the seminary for free. So I would accumulate the money that I would get from Maryknoll for my living expenses. And anyway, you can see these desks, they're 2-person desks. And basically this lecture room and then about 8 classrooms, because in the old days, the desk, if you try to write on them, your pencil would go right through because it was so full of dents and holes and whatever. And so over the period of about 3 years, I changed all the desks in all the classrooms, put in all the acoustical ceilings and new lighting, and the air conditioning went in afterwards. I had nothing to do with that. But, and these would be, again, some of my students. You'll notice they're Egyptian Franciscans, they're Egyptian Carmelites, as well as diocesan seminarians and seminarians from several different rites, mainly the Syrian Catholics, the Coptic Catholics, and the Maryknoll Catholics, which are Lebanese. This is actually one of the places where I helped to say Mass. It was a German congregation, and they're mainly now German-speaking Egyptians. I think the next photo is going to show at least part of that community. It's an amazing group of women. I actually got drafted from my days when I was in the Air Force and worked in the hotel in Germany. My German conversationally has gotten pretty weak, but I can still get through the Mass pretty well. And what I would do is do the Mass in English. And if I gave a homily, like on a Sunday Mass, the Mass would be in German, and I would try to switch and do the homily in Arabic, which didn't always work in terms of switching gears. But this was their convent, and they run 3 of the best German schools for girls in the country. In fact, the Catholic school system for boys and girls is the best education system in the country, and about 80% of the students in any school are Muslim. So it has a lot to do with actually cultivating critically thinking, well-educated Muslims, along with Christians that are Orthodox and Catholic, with a few Protestants. And these ladies too run a clinic in the back, and it's mainly Muslims who come to the clinic because it's a low-cost clinic. And they handle between 500 and 800 outpatients a day, which to me is almost, incomprehensible considering the size of that place. But they start lining up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they go strong until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then they stop and are pretty much exhausted. They actually have one of the nicest grounds, as you can see, in terms of the gardens and everything. Probably it's like an oasis in the middle of insanity when it comes to Egypt. This would be just part of the community. Anseta, who is the one in the front on the left side, she's the one that just passed away about a year ago. She was the last of the German sisters. Francesca, behind her, she's actually from Romanian, but a German speaker. And then the 4 other sisters, 3 of them are actually blood sisters as well, from Suhag down south. Quite a few of the congregation of that particular community in Madi, which is the suburb I lived in south of Cairo. Several of them have moved around. With Anseta's death, the German sister, the one on the right in front, is now the superior of the group. But when we talk about life and love and legacy, they showed me so much TLC over the years. And like this last June, when it was my birthday a couple of months ago, they called me up, I think it was on WhatsApp, and they sang me happy birthday in English, German, and Arabic. And they're just a great bunch of ladies, and they got so much courage and so much energy. It just puts me to shame. This is, that's Bernadette, and this guy, obviously, they're treating as an outpatient who has severe burns. And, they do everything at that clinic, but they do it with a smile, as you can see. This is Our Lady Queen of Peace, or Our Lady of Peace Home for Special Needs. When I got involved in it in 1999, it was 2 floors of bricks and reinforced concrete. Nothing was finished and nothing was moving because they'd run out of funds. Basically, Maryknoll, over a period of 5 years, put in about $265,000 into this, roughly 100,000, 2 years in a row, 50,000. And then I started weaning him off of Maryknoll money. In terms of my parents' personal money, my inheritance, and sponsor money from people who've supported me over the last 25 years, many of whom were former expatriate parishioners I had in Egypt. I put in another 250,000. So out of a $2.2 million project, between Maryknoll, my personal supporters, sponsors, donors, and my parents' inheritance, we put in over $500,000 into this thing. It has about 35 special needs kids that are anything from autism to Down syndrome, because there's a lot of close repeated generational intermarriage within families. There are some that have, certain mental issues because, one generation doesn't seem to affect things in terms of physical and mental issues. But when you get into several successive generations, then it starts showing up physically and mentally at times. There's also an orphanage in that sharing the property called Good Samaritan Orphanage, Samaria Saleh. And then the top floor is supposed to be guest rooms, which for a long time weren't getting used because they weren't guest friendly in the sense of not being air conditioned. I believe they finally solved that problem. And over to the right, which doesn't show up in the picture, is a nice therapy pool. And that's where I used to work with some of the kids when it came to swimming. And down below actually was an exercise area. And I used to work on teaching them how to exercise as well as building their self-confidence. And this is what opened in 2004. And now it's still operating 16 years later. That's me. And Atiat she's autistic. And she's a character and a half. She's been there almost since it opened. A lot of the problems is the parents are very often concerned about the kids. And I call them kids, but some of them, like George on the other side of me, is like 60 years old. And he's got a relative that lives in Montreal. But the big thing is the families worry about who's going to take care of them as they get older, because very often their siblings don't want the responsibility. And the other thing is, in the old days, it was almost like, in the Bible with the man born blind, whose sin is it? And so sometimes they feel that it's either God's judgment or people judging them, that God somehow has punished them for something by giving them a special needs child. So one of the things, by this being modeled after Jean Vanier's Faith and Light group, L'Arche, is to try to put them more out in public. So we actually rent out facilities, including the pool and a conference center. So there's more exposure between these special needs kids and the neighbors living in the neighborhoods and other people coming in to use the facilities. And this is just another one of the special needs kids. I honestly had just forgotten her name because I didn't make it to Egypt this year. My short-term memory is setting in. But anyway, I wish I could remember her name, but I can't. And I won't pretend to give you one because it'd be a lie. But the kids are generally pretty sweet. I mean, occasionally you'll have one that's got a little bit of a behavioral issue like some of the autistic kids, but by and large, they've pretty much learned that they're secure and that the way they get along is to live better together without getting into major arguments and fights. This is Careless, and Careless, if I had other pictures, he's now about 22. This is when he was about 17, and he came first when he was about 5, and he's got a little bit of a mental issue, but it's much more actually CP, cerebral palsy. And I worked with him a lot when he was a kid on coordination in terms of walking and stuff like that. But and he goes to a normal school now. The only thing is they're not big into therapy in Egypt, and we really could have used a speech therapist, and I just didn't have enough time to work with him as he got older. So he's still pretty limited in terms of oral communication. These are some of my guys. The one on the right has actually got a project. This is the desert area of Asyut. I've got current pictures, but I didn't bother to give them to Christy. But that's Meta, and the guy next to him is Hanabulis. I could tell a whole bunch of stories because I spent a lot of time with him in one diocese south of here. Or actually, this is the same diocese. This is Asyut. And Laisha, and he was one of my spiritual directees, along with Ayman Hanabulis, and then this is Abram. And so anyway, all 4 of those were my students. And Meta, who's over on the right, has built an incredible retreat center. And he basically did what so many people do. He took an area in the desert and he's made it turn green. He's got some beautiful architectural buildings. This was just while they were still building. We had a picnic in one of the existing buildings. This is one of the projects too. That was a church in Zarabi, and I helped to finance some of the restorations in that. These are some of the kids with the church before it was renovated on the outside. You can see the scaffolding. And we just last year put up a whole play area for them, you know, with swings and all sorts of stuff. And so that's part of that crew from Ezrabi. And that's a pastoral center. It was a little bit more ostentatious than I would have wanted because I put some big money into this thing too. But the priest was actually living in the balcony of his church for almost 2.5 years when he tore down the former priest residence. And this is a pastoral center. So the downstairs ground floor is a conference room with a kitchen and an office. The next floor is basically the residence of priests. The next floor is a residence for retreatants. And there is a basement which he might make into a clinic if he can get the money and doesn't get in trouble with the government. This is Malek Wahba. He's another priest of mine who's married, and he's also the administrator of Hope Hospital. And I've been helping him with the dialysis center he has in that hospital, and that's in El Fakreya in the Minya diocese. This is just the courtyard. Depending on the percentage of Christians and Catholic or Orthodox in a village, this is actually a high percentage village. And so the Catholics and the Orthodox are a little bolder in terms of their facilities, in terms of illuminated crosses and statues and nice courtyards and stuff like that. But at different times, especially in the revolutionary period with when Mubarak got overthrown and Morsi came in, there was a fair amount of violence in this village. And actually 2 people were killed, and then 22 the doors were kicked in. It was during Holy Week a few years ago. And to show you kind of the weird justice, the Muslims were eventually acquitted. The Christians were given life sentences. And then actually they commuted the life sentences to time served and let them out. So justice, unfortunately, in Egypt is kind of by the whim of the judge at the time and the whim of judges and government after that. So it's kind of a weird situation. I spent 7 years visiting foreign prisoners in Egyptian prisons, and I wasn't allowed to visit Egyptian ones because I was a foreigner. But the justice system leaves a wee bit to be desired. And again, this is one of the guys that's involved in the prison ministries, also was the associate pastor in Abu Ghargas, which just became a diocese of its own now. This actually is on Tone, and he's recently deceased. He lived to be about 90. I don't know if Christy's going to post the website or the YouTube site, but there's a nice film on that prison ministry with the Muslim sheikh. It's before Mahmoud Goma and the previous priest that you just saw got involved. But it's a 10-minute video on this prison ministry with Christians and Muslims working together. This is the other priest. This is Bolas Nassif, who I very often talk about when it comes to Christian-Muslim encounter, because I really don't like the word dialogue. But he's a phenomenal guy who's one of my earlier students from back in the 80s. But his ability, he also has a catechetical class for hearing impaired as well as the prison ministry. This is him, and that's the Muslim sheikh, the 2 originals, and that's demonstrating against sectarian violence in the diocese. And those are Muslims as well as Christians together. That sign, that's part of the same demonstration. And the sign, that yellow sign goes, Ana Muslim, Ana Masihi, Ana Masri, which is basically saying, you know, in spite of our differences being Muslim and Christians, we're first and foremost Egyptians. And in this day of our adversarial relationships over politics, we could learn something from them in terms of for and against Trump, for and against Biden, who's a Republican, who's a Democrat, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, this is basically just a couple of the bishops meeting Pope Francis, obviously. And that's the oldest bishop. He was ordained a bishop the same year, who's holding hands with Francis. He was ordained a bishop the same year I became a priest, so he's been a bishop about 35 years. He's retired now. The other one behind him is retired. The one with the nice smile on his face, over kind of by himself on the left, is my favorite guy, and he's retired now too, but that's Yusuf Abu Khair. And one of the more recent bishops is in the background, but he's the one that just left his diocese, so I don't know what the reasons are yet. Sorry to go too long, but I guess I get enthused when I start talking about things I do.
Thank you, Doug. Very well done. I don't think any of us would have any any question to doubt your short-term or long-term memory. There's some great stories there in those slides. And appropriate, the last several ones really fit in with our questions. We've got a couple. Agnes asks, from your experience and perspective from your years living in Egypt, could you talk about Arab-Christian relations, especially in the last years when the tragic church bombings occurred? What is your memory of these bombings, and how did the Christian-Arab relations change after that?
Well, you know, you can make your links to the current situation if you wish, but, you know, Mubarak was actually a fairly decent president, but he was a president for 30 years and should have left after 10 or 20, okay? And so there was a lot of frustrations building up, and this links to what your question is, okay? But it can't be done in isolation. Gamal Mubarak, who was his son and actually was kind of his heir apparent, the military didn't want him. And so when the people rose up against Mubarak, it was partly to get rid of Mubarak. It was partly to get rid of, make sure his son didn't become president, and the military didn't want the son to be president, so they facilitated that. Then we had no real government except a military government, the general running the show for almost a year. They kept putting off elections. The only one party that really had its act together was the Brotherhood. The purists that were involved in the demonstrations that got rid of Mubarak, they couldn't agree on a platform. And what happened is they kind of bit off their nose to spite their face at times. What I used to hear over and over again is Ahmed Shafiq, who was the other candidate in the final election. A lot of the purists said, well, we won't vote for Ahmed Shafiq because he was tied with Mubarak, and we don't want anybody that was tied with Mubarak to get into the government again. And yet he was the better candidate in the sense of administration. He had put Egypt Air on the map. He had done a lot of development projects, even though he could be rude and crude at times, like, you know, who. But so they bit off their nose and to spite their face in some ways, because they said, well, we're not going to vote for Ahmed Shafiq, and either we're not going to vote at all, or we're going to vote for Mohammed Morsi from the Brotherhood, which is the last thing they wanted to do because he was Brotherhood. When Mohammed Morsi got elected and the Brotherhood, it was almost like every bigot and every sectarian adversarial person in Egypt crawled out from under their rocks, and it was free. It was like a free market discrimination against Christians. And it was pretty bad. I mean, if you're trying to get a gas bottle for your stove, a woman could be standing in line to get a bottle for her gas stove. She'd get to the place where she's supposed to get it, and they say, well, we have gas, but not for you. Go away. People were being insulted and even spit at in the women's cars that were segregated because there was a fair amount of harassment from males to women. And it got to the point where Christians women were preferring to take the integrated male-female cars because they were getting less insulted and attacked than they were in the women's cars. So during Morsi's time, it was like everything went belly up when it came to any kind of decent Muslim-Christian relations. At the same time, when we got rid of Morsi, which was a year later, and everybody calls it a coup, but all I can tell you is almost everybody was fed up. But the government went out of their, the military went out of their way to make Morsi look even worse than he was, with water shortages and power outages and gasoline shortages, you name it, we were short. But the demonstrators in favor of Morsi demonstrated for another month after he was overthrown. And then the government said, we're going to disperse you if you want to disperse on your own. There was a forced dispersal. About 1,000 1,000 demonstrators were killed that were Muslim. And then the response to that, this would have been 2013 in mid-August, was about 70 churches, schools, rectories, and convents were broken into, gutted, and burned. The only thing they never showed on the news, though, is where there were good relations between the Muslim leadership and the Christian leadership in a village. It was actually the Muslims who would come into a town, the ones where the relationship was good. The Muslims in that town would actually stand guard around the Christian institutions to keep the Muslim extremists from a neighboring town coming in and trying to cause trouble. I'm not a romantic though, because like I said, I mean, this stuff happens. The church that was bombed next to the cathedral in Cairo, I think 26 people were maybe killed in that. And actually the sister and mother of one of my parishioners, who was a Coptic Orthodox married to a Latin Catholic, but she would go to my masses. She lost her mother and her sister and has another sister who's permanently handicapped because of that. The amazing thing in conferences I've had with her is she said, as Christians, we're still told we have to forgive. That doesn't always work, because vengeance killings and honor killings are still alive and well in the Middle East in terms of not only Muslims, but Christians and Jews. And so you're dealing with that whole cultural reality as well. It's hard. I mean, since Baba Tewodros, the Pope, our Coptic Orthodox Pope, has become Pope, and Sisi has become the president, they have really tried to overtly show the Christian leadership and the Egyptian leadership, which is generally Muslim, are supporting each other. It doesn't always work in reality, especially at the local level, but that's what they try to promote. I think that might be the best answer I can give.
Thank you. That's helpful. I think very, very thorough. You is asking, he was in Cairo in the 60s before the 67 war. Mm-hmm. He visited a Jewish synagogue. How has the Jewish community fared since that time?
Yeah, well, there are 5 synagogues in Cairo and a huge one in Alexandria. Those were where the Jewish pockets were. There were Jewish actors and actresses that were very popular. The beginning of the end of the Jewish presence in Egypt was 1948 with the creation of Israel, the 1956 war, and for sure the 1967 war. After the 67 war, in general, most Jews, Jewish Egyptians, left Egypt. And either they emigrated to Europe or the West, or they went to Israel. That's a really sensitive topic. I'm not shy about talking about it in terms of my spin on it. But again, Egypt was so inclusive during King Farouk's time. Farouk, who was the king before the revolution of 1952, he was a big secularist. He tried to Europeanize Egypt and make it open to Christians and Muslims as well as and Jews. And Gamal Abdel Nasser, until the 56 war, basically, especially among Christians and Muslims, would not tolerate any kind of dissension. He just wouldn't put up with it. If you got in a fight with a Christian or got in a fight with a Muslim, you went to prison and maybe never saw the light of day again. The Jewish thing, like I said, they've made different attempts to encourage what few Jews still live in Egypt to kind of surface and use the synagogues, but pretty much it's minuscule. Now, after Camp David, you used to have a huge number of Israeli tourists visiting Egypt because things were so cheap. You didn't have as many tourists going from Egypt to Israel. You had some Christians, but not many Muslims. But that's, it's an interesting thing because in a way, what some people would call anti-Semitic in the West is really anti-Israel, which is different than being anti-Semitic. And you have to live there to understand the difference between being anti-Semitic and anti-Israel.
Just to follow up on a little different tack there, you had another question. How has Egypt dealt with solar energy? I think that, and maybe even a talk about how in the oil-rich Middle East, what is the effect now of alternate forms of energy, but also as the pandemic has reduced the need for oil, how is that affecting that whole region?
Well, part of it when it comes to Egypt is Egypt doesn't have all that much oil except in the Sinai, and it inherited that back when the Israelis turned the Sinai back to Egypt as part of Camp David. But they're barely self-sufficient in oil. They also are obliged as part of Camp David to supply part of Israel's petroleum needs. The nice thing about solar energy, for what it's worth, is it's only cloudy about 15 days a year and it only rains about 5 of those. except up by the Mediterranean coast. So solar energy would be a big thing, but the hardest thing to get into a mentality there, even though Egypt has a humongously long history, they very seldom think about tomorrow. They look back at the past, they think about today, but when it comes to future planning, so many of them are subsistence livers that they really don't think ahead too much. The Arab countries, quite a few of them have gotten into solar energy because they realize down the road there's going to be a limit to their petroleum, both for exporting and for domestic use. And so quite a few of them are starting to invest in solar energy. That's it for that.
What can we, in your opinion, what can we as American Catholics, American Christians, do to support Christians in Egypt and in the Middle East?
Well, one of the things is I hate to plug another group because Maryknoll, obviously, since I'm not there anymore, isn't too involved in the Middle East. And I'm obviously not too involved except for my month there, and I still support projects there. Catholic Near East Welfare Association, which has a Canadian branch as well as an American branch and puts out a magazine called One, is a real supporter of various Christian activities, not only Catholic, but Orthodox and even some Muslim activities in Egypt, as well as a lot of their resources have been taken by trying to help out both in Israel, Palestine in terms of the Palestinians, in Syria because of the war, in Iraq because of the war. And so their supplies for Egypt are somewhat limited, but because there's so many other needs in the Middle East, especially by the Christian communities. But I would say CNEWA, Catholic Near East Welfare Association, would be a #1 source of support if you wanted to do it in a general way. They also support a lot of the seminaries that I believe this is 10-year-old information, but about 10 years ago, CNEWA, Catholic Near East Welfare, was kicking in about $135,000 a year to support the Coptic Seminary in Cairo, where I was. And they also put out that magazine, which very often is quite informative in terms of talking about Eastern Catholic and Orthodox rights, as well as, sometimes it at least touches on political issues and social issues, as well as the religious issues. Unfortunately, Maryknoll, because nobody's really over there except for me when I go, can't really do too much. And because I'm not there assigned, I can't get project money. So I pretty much depend on my parents' inheritance and donor money from people who've been giving, supporting my projects over the years.
Okay, thank you. Along those same lines, with the projects you have supported, the handicapped home, for example, what is the government's position or ability to support any type of social services in Egypt?
The government is ready to help, but when the help comes interference. And so very often, you can see that when it comes to the Catholic school system, because they get government assistance and they also get a lot of government interference. And for what it's worth, I hate to say this because if the wrong person's listening to this, I might not get my visa the next time. But, I'm going to just say what somebody said to me one time. Anything the government touches, if it's run by private enterprise, turns to shit. And it's pretty much, unfortunately, the way it is. It's bureaucracy, it's interference by people who aren't professionals to get involved in running institutions that demand professionalism. And it's kind of sad. There's a fair amount of corruption. The Catholic school system, for instance, probably the best politicians, the best actors, actresses, doctors, screenplay writers, you name it, are Muslims and Christians that went to Egyptian schools. The Franciscans have a cultural center. The German Sisters have a cultural center. And it's amazing the work that these Catholic education systems, the Jesuits, the Good Shepherd Sisters, Sacred Heart Sisters, the German Sisters of Charles Borromeo, the Christian Brothers, they have done phenomenal work when it comes to formation education of Egyptian young people.
Agnes has a follow-up question. She said you had visited West Gaza. if she recalls correctly. Can you talk about what you saw there? How do Palestinians survive from what we know with the ever worsening living conditions there? That's a very good, timely question.
Okay, one of the things we're confusing things a little bit. Gaza is a part that was ruled by Egypt before the 67 war, and it's closest to the Sinai. That's Gaza. What's called the West Bank, which is kind of, if you were to draw a line, somewhat from Jerusalem over to the Jordanian border, the Jordan River, that's the West Bank, not West Gaza. Here's a couple of things that might get you a little bit going like, what's he talking about? But I've actually heard it, even Israelis admit this, even on television, if you caught the BBC at the right times. Palestinians are, by and large, until, let's say, the last 50 years, were phenomenally secular as well as probably the most highly educated. Obviously, they didn't have their own country per se. They were living under Ottoman Turkish occupation, then they were under British occupation in terms of the British Mandate. And then there was the 48 war, the 56 war, the 67 war, the 73 war. And Palestinians very often got caught in the middle of it all because they didn't have their own armies. And so it was like Egypt and Syria and Jordan fighting against the Israelis. And it's always been difficult when you talk about the situation because in many ways, I got a good taste of it. For 2 years, I was a volunteer with the Palestine Red Crescent Society, which had a nursing school. And one of the things I voluntarily did was teach English for nursing studies because in Egypt, a lot of the medical studies are all taught in English. And so I had mainly Palestinian refugee kids, some of whom were over there just to study, and some of whom actually their parents came after the 67 or 73 war. One of the things is you got is the fact that, and then we had about a half a dozen Maryknollers there during the 90s. We had several Maryknoll brothers, a couple of Maryknoll priests, and a couple of Maryknoll lay missioners. When I worked for the Palestine Red Crescent Society, one of the things is the guy who interviewed me was Yasser Arafat's brother, who was Fethi Arafat, who was the president of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, who lived in Cairo and managed the Palestine Hospital as well. The reason why I bring this up is because I don't know if Fethi Arafat, the brother of Yasser, actually knew whether I was in the room or knew or cared that I understood Arabic or not, but he would talk to the Palestinian students. And these students mainly, like I said, were from Gaza, a few from the West Bank, but they were all Muslim. There wasn't a single Christian in the place. And how I got in there was a mystery in some ways. But anyway, what I was going to say is when he did speak to his students, he would constantly harp on the fact that at least for them, that was the older generation, they weren't so much for the destruction of Jews, but they said, you know, unfortunately, with the agreement of the UN and the creation of this dual, you know, two-state thing that the Arabs rejected because they said, why should we be giving up half of our territory? And the Israelis knew that they would refuse it. And they said, yes, we will have a two-state solution. And that was back in 48. But the big thing is he kept saying, we have not lost our dream of a Palestinian state where Christians, Muslims, and Jews can live together in a secular country. And then he would say, I don't care if you want to start your day in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or in the name of God, the most merciful and compassionate, which is how you say Bismillah or Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. You know, if you want to wear the veil, wear the veil. You don't want to wear the veil, don't wear the veil. You want to fast, fast. If you don't want to fast, don't fast. We're not going to do to ourselves what's been done to us. And I actually took him at his word. But then the next day when I was teaching in that school, I polled the students, which would have been 1 or 2 generations younger, newer. And I said, would you like a secular state? Would you like an Islamic republic? Or would you want some kind of a kingdom like in Saudi Arabia or Jordan or something like that? And without exception, almost every student had said, we want an Islamic republic. Now, again, they were all Muslim. And I said, well, what about what Fethi Arafat said the day before? They said, we have watched our grandparents and parents listen to the Arafats talking about a country, and they haven't gotten us anywhere. We've lost more territory and we've lost more of our rights. We're now living in an apartheid system. And therefore, the only way we're going to survive is if we take whatever we can get for land and become an Islamic republic. And then I said, well, what about the Christian minorities? And they said, you know, because we didn't beat around the bush when we had these conversations. And they said, they'll be protected. I said, no, thank you very much. I've seen your protection in other Muslim countries, like in Iran and Bangladesh, for instance. And, you know, that was one of the discussions always. Basically, up until now, Christian and Muslim Palestinians have pretty much gotten along with each other because they see they're being treated almost the same by the Israelis. And so, and again, there's another great film about the predicament of Palestinian Christians put out by this woman named Yasmin Perny, whose husband still is, Ben Wiedemann from CNN. But she produced a film, it's a 55-minute documentary called The Stones Cry Out, and it specifically focuses on the situation of Christians in Palestine. You can get pieces of it on YouTube, and you can order it. I think if you type in The Stones Cry Out, Yasmin Perny, if you wanted to buy a copy, because it's on distribution. She showed it actually at Washington National Cathedral, among other places.
Could you just comment a bit on what do you see as the prospects for peace overall in the Middle East, and particularly, as you were mentioning, between, you know, Palestinians, Israelis, Saudi Arabians, all the players there in the Middle East?
I'm going to say what I'm going to say. It's my opinion, but it's shared by an awful lot of people who seem to claim to be in the know, as well as some of the people from that NGO, the Center for Arab West Understanding, that I work with. I'm not sure if there'll ever be peace in what we would like to call peace. I'm not sure if anybody really wants it. We talk about it, but first of all, you know, and this is going to sound rough, but I'm going to say it anyway, because it's what I know or feel anyway. Israel has never had any intention of having a Palestinian state. They've never had any intention of giving back a square centimeter of the West Bank. They don't really care about Gaza because Gaza is worthless anyway. But West Bank's got the water and the land. And there was actually supposedly wheelings and dealings that some people would say, no way, Jose, but I've learned you have to keep a scorecard about who's sleeping with who when it comes to this kind of Middle Eastern politics, that the Brotherhood and Hamas and the Israelis were actually trying to figure out if they couldn't establish a Palestinian state, taking part of the Egyptian Sinai and merging it with Gaza, and basically putting the screws to the West Bankers who refuse to be part of Hamas and are still somewhat quasi-democratic and secular, even though Mahmoud Abbas hasn't left for the God knows how long. He's been technically the president of the Palestine National Council, PNC. Another thing from that Center for Arab West Understanding is we coined a phrase called structured instability. And with structured instability, the idea is why we don't want out of control war, we definitely don't want peace. Because if you really had peace, the biggest market for weapons and US made weapons, along with European weapons and Russian weapons and a few other countries that contribute and make money off of weapons sales, is the Middle East. And you can also maintain spheres of influence if you maintain instability. So why we don't want things to get out of control, we definitely don't want peace. I mean, I'm speaking as someone who would, let's say, have stock in armaments companies and stuff like that. The governments themselves, I mean, even when it comes to this recent peace with Bahrain and the UAE, what's promoting that is not so much that all of a sudden the UAE and Bahrain are playing kissy touchy-feely with Israel. It's that they know that Israel's had nuclear weapons since 1971. Both Bahrain, which was claimed for I don't know how long, by Iran as a province, just like Kuwait was claimed by Iraq as a province, which goes back to when Kuwait became independent, and probably with Iran when Bahrain became independent back in the 60s or early 70s. The big thing is probably Iran, especially since we backed out of the nuclear deal with Iran. And you could debate whether that was a good deal or a bad deal. But since Iran seems to be moving in the direction of a nuclear warhead, the only country that would be able to take them on would be Israel. And, that's something to remember, because the Arabs, you have to remember too, Iran is not Arab, it's Persian. And there's a historical that goes back centuries, animosity between Persians and Arabs, between Sunnis and Shias and all this kind of stuff. And so the idea of Iran having a nuclear weapon and them not having any nuclear weapons to fight back, guess what? Who's got nuclear weapons and has had them for almost 50 years? Israel. So, it's the old expression in different cultures, you may be my enemy, but if you and I share an enemy, you and I can fight the other enemy that we share together. And so I think what's brought, Bahrain and the UAE into the fold when it comes to peace with Israel, I think has a lot more to do with Iran than it has to do with peace with Israel. But the same thing too is hardly any group has ever been totally loyal to the Palestinian cause. And, as oil gets a little bit scarcer, you're going to start to see that Israel has the technology to make up some of the gaps that the Arab countries, oil countries might start suffering down the road. So, there's nothing, totally centering on peace. They used to always talk about the Arabs pushing for this two-state solution. But anybody who's in the know knows that the two-state solution has been geographically impossible for over a decade. And back in 2008, which is 12 years ago, I actually, before she became Speaker of the House, had a Palm Sunday Mass for Nancy Pelosi at the Grand Hyatt in Cairo with a congressional delegation, and I wasn't mixing words with her. I basically, as it said, the roadmap to peace is a roadmap to pieces. The Israelis use the word peace in almost every sentence, but they don't spell it P-A-C-E, they spell it P-I-E-C-E. And the Israeli-American concept of a Palestinian state at best would be a scattering of American-styled Indian reservations selling cheap gas and cigarettes. And I know what I'm talking about because I just bought cheap gas and cigarettes at an Indian reservation in New York. Not too many cigarettes, but a lot of gas. And so that's the reality, and if you want to believe that peace is possible, have at it. But if you're talking about peace with justice, if it ever happens, it's a long way off. And you can't get into this whole issue. And that's a whole nother discussion of Christian Zionism and the belief by some Catholics, but mainly evangelical Protestants, that the creation of the modern state of Israel is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Because for one thing, in the Old Testament sense, and even the Ottoman Turkish sense, Christians in the same sense, they look at groups of people as nations, not as political states per se. And Christianity is considered to be a Christian tribe. And for instance, in Egypt, the local Christian chief is Tawadros of the Coptic Orthodox Church. But the big Christian chief of the worldwide Christianity is Baba Francis, Pope Francis of Baba Vatican, the Pope of the Vatican. And in a way, when it comes to Israel, it's looked at the same way. The Israelites in the ITES was kind of a tribal designator like Hittites, Amorites, whatever. And so as a tribe, the Arabs have no problem to some degree, probably to a big degree. But as a political nation where they saw, and obviously you could say, well, it was Jewish, and then it was Christian, and then the Muslims took it from the Christians with Salah al-Din and I don't know who else. And it's been going back and forth. But that's one of the problems too, is to what degree are you going to apply Christian and Jewish biblical tradition or teaching, scripture, to people who don't necessarily share that tradition and that scripture. And it's too easy to say, we're right, they're wrong, we have the truth, theirs is just so much BS. it doesn't, you know, in world politics, you can't be that simplistic.
Father, that's a scary picture you painting for us for the future.
Well, unless we're willing to do something realistically when it comes. Look at, actually one of my better friends, I haven't seen her in years, but she used to write for the Catholic Near East Welfare magazine. Her name is Linda Breyer. She was a South African Jewish lawyer who came to Israel as a Zionist and somewhere discovered the plight of the Palestinians, along with Mark Ellis, who is a Jewish professor who used to run our Justice and Peace Department and just retired recently from Baylor University. And both of them have basically say Israel is an apartheid state. It's as democratic for Jews as South Africa was for whites, and as undemocratic and repressive for Palestinians as South Africa was for blacks. And unless you're willing to deal with reality and not with spins, and I'll be honest with you, every news agency nowadays spins. Probably the least would be the BBC, but there's not a single American news agency, network television or cable, that doesn't spin like crazy. And I just sit there sometimes and just watch and roll my eyes when it comes. For instance, I was at Jerusalem during the first Gulf War. The first Gulf War, I think, was 37 days, give or take. Okay, everybody talked about Iraq, is Saddam is threatening Israel. Out of 37 days, only 34 Scuds were fired off. Not one hit its target, and only 2 Israelis were indirectly killed at the result of a Scud attack. One because he asphyxiated himself with a gas mask being on wrong, and the other one died of a heart attack due to anxiety. Okay, and all we kept hearing is how Saddam was threatening Israel. And basically, you know, the British ambassador to Israel, or I think it was back in 1999 when I first came back to Egypt, he was on BBC and he said, you know, you got to deal with reality. You know, the Israelis keep saying the Arabs and the Palestinians are going to push them into the sea. And this British ambassador said, with what? Israel's got the nuclear weapons and they have the most sophisticated military and number 4 in the world at the time. And that's the one thing is unfortunately the big issue over there. It's a little like it's verbosity. Okay, it's I hate to keep drawing parallels, but a lot of the leaders over there are talk very similar to our current president. You know, it's a lot of talk and not a lot of action, and it's difficult when you're part of that. I sometimes felt embarrassed because I found myself all the time trying to explain the American position to Egyptians and Arabs, and then I come back to the States and I'm trying to defend, you know, trying not to defend, but to explain the Middle Eastern position, Arabs mainly, in the US. And it's a very uncomfortable place to be when you feel loyal to the US, but realize that there's a big difference between patriotism and nationalism, in the sense that a true patriot, and an ex-veteran or a veteran, an ex-Air Force guy, you know, if he truly loves his country, he has to be ready to criticize his government. And you'll find Israelis, actually, many Israelis, like we're aligned. I belong to a group in Asheville, North Carolina called Just Peace for Israel's Palestine, and we merged with Jewish Voices for Peace on some of our outreaches. And it's amazing. Most, you know, an Israeli who's truly aware of what the government is doing can be just as critical, and there are a fairly large group of American Jews who can be just as critical of Israeli government apartheid as some Americans would say, I love my country, but that doesn't mean I'm totally in love with my government. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Well, Father, I live in America for a long time and I love this country. I'm loyal to this nation, but this is the country which built Israel. All the technologies, the money in billions come from United States of America. I mean, maybe we should talk to our representatives to minimize that help. They've already grown too much.
Yeah, but the lobbies, I mean, basically you have a thing called Christian Zionism, and you have this group called CUFI, which is Christians United for Israel. And when you realize that, for instance, at the last Kufi convention in DC, you had Pompeo, you had Bolton, and you had Pence all there addressing that conference in person, talking about the United States' undying loyalty to Israel. I think Israel eventually cursed us, because one of the reasons why is we facilitated illegal settlement building since '67. And you know, when it comes to this large number of Palestinians that are living there under occupation, guess what? Down the road, if there is no two-state solution, that means that we'll give up on that idea, because it's a fallacy for at least the last decade. You're talking about this one-state solution, and then are you going to allow ongoing apartheid to exist the same way it existed in South Africa? Because the Israelis will be forced to make some decisions. They're either going to talk about exiling the Palestinians and saying, hey, the rest of the world is Arab around you, go to Egypt, go to Jordan, go to Syria, whatever. Or you're talking about extermination, or you're talking about maintaining apartheid, or you're talking about giving them full equal rights. And in a way, that's really going to be their death, because sooner or later they'll all populate and outvote the Israelis, which means that's the end of Israel as a Jewish state. If the best that can happen then is it becomes a secular state or a Muslim state. And so in a way, we're facilitating the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. I very often tell people, don't tell me I'm anti-Semitic. In fact, in ways, don't even tell me I'm anti-Israel. If you truly loved Israel, you would force them to stop. Literally, Mark Ellis, who is this Jewish professor that was at Maryknoll and just retired from Baylor University, did an interview on Jordanian television back in 1991 in the fall after the first war, Gulf War. And he literally said, the best thing you can do to Israel is force them to stop. That was almost 20 years ago. And he literally was suggesting that there be a UN resolution where, almost like the one for going into Iraq with the first Gulf War, basically saying, Israel, either you go back to pre-67 borders, or we will send in a UN force that will forcibly create the Palestinian state, and we will a UN force that maintains the borders until you two learn how to figure out how to live together, or figure out how to merge if that's what you want. But the way they're living now is unsustainable, and they can't go on. And that was an American Jew, okay? And this is something we got to get at, is we have to be critically thinking, and we also have to try to say what serves justice, which ultimately brings about peace. Because you can force a peace with submission, but you're always, almost like Ireland in Northern Ireland, you're always going to have that undercurrent of resentment and anger and hatred. And that's why you have to figure out a way to get this thing solved, but not through submission and you know, or occupation. So do I have any really good answers? It would be hard. The only thing I can say is my background is labor relations, and when you would hit an impasse in a labor dispute, they had a thing called a final offer arbitration. And then basically you would agree on an arbitrator, and he would say to the two parties, labor and management, you have X number of days or weeks to talk to one another seriously, stop all the BS, and then you have to come up, both of you, with a proposal. And if they've truly got down to the nitty gritty of what is essential and what they've figured out, talking seriously with each other, what they could bargain on and off of, each one would submit a proposal, and then the arbitrator has to take that proposal as it's written and presented and not make any alterations. And that would force the two parties to get together, talk seriously, and come up with almost very similar proposals. If the United Nations, if the US would get out of the way with its veto, could say to Israel and Palestine, you have 6 weeks to get together, sit down and talk seriously. And when you're talking, at the end of 6 weeks, we want a presentation, a proposal from each party, the Palestinians and the Israelis. If either one is too unreasonable, then the arbitrator is going to have to take the other position, the other proposal, and you lose out because you're being too outrageously demanding. And to me, the biggest opposition to something like that happening is the United States with the veto.
Jorge has a comment and a question here. Maybe you could, briefly respond to this. Jorge says, thank you for being honest and at the same time compassionate about news that are not necessarily reflected here in the U.S. It's a sad reality what real information we are receiving in this country. How do we fulfill our missionary calling feeling blindsided about the rest of the world? Perhaps you could just summarize briefly and then end with a prayer for us. Maybe on a hopeful note, Father Doug.
Well, that ain't very easy because, you know, the old saying is pray for peace, work for justice. And in a way, that's what you have to do. But in a way, even to realize that there's injustice, we have to educate ourselves and encourage other people to educate themselves. I can still remember in 1985, Miguel de Soto, who was, you know, got defrocked as a priest or suspended because he was the foreign minister for Nicaragua. And believe it or not, you know, 5 or 10 years ago, whenever it was, ended up by being the UN ambassador for Nicaragua, and ended up being president of the General Assembly. But one of the things that he would say, and it surprised a lot of even Maryknollers who just thought to be pro-peace, you have to be pro-Israel. You know, the Israel was the underdog. He basically said, you have to understand that we have to be critical of our politicians because they also are phenomenally no longer representing us or ideals of the United States, that it's their own self-interest and their own political parties, which is sad to say, but it's the truth. And he basically said something like, the United States, and this is like 35 years ago, but I still remember, has like a diplomatic case of cancer. And he basically said, just like a doctor who has to tell their patient, if they truly care for and love their patient and don't want to BS them, you have cancer. And now we know you have cancer, we can enact a treatment for the cancer so we can hopefully cure you or at least slow down the movement of the cancer. And he said, you as a Maryknoller, as a missioner, have to educate yourself and make yourself aware enough of the different positions that you can figure out a way of trying to create critical thinking and reflection on some of these political issues and try to get other people to critically think and reflect on these issues so that they don't just buy what's on the news, that they try to read. You know, like Elias Shakur, who's the retired Greek Catholic bishop of Galilee. He wrote a book that I first read, you know, 30-some years ago called Blood Brothers, that talked about the destinies of Israelis and Palestinians being linked because in a way they are blood brothers. Got books like The Palestinian Question by Edward Said. The film The Stones Cry Out by Yasmin Parody, the 55-minute documentary on the plight of Palestinian Christians, which in many ways gives you a brief history in the process of the Israeli-Arab situation over the last 70 years since 1948. But education, promoting critical thinking, occasionally challenging politicians. I mean, I'm totally, unfortunately, disappointed with Biden as much as I can't stand Trump, especially for opening the embassy in Jerusalem and some other moves. Biden is totally sold out along with Harris when it comes to this whole Middle Eastern issue. And it's really heartbreaking for me. I had high hopes for Obama. Unfortunately, he said a lot of great things, but didn't always go through with it. The Oslo Accords were a sham, especially with Dennis Ross, who was anything but unbiased when it came to negotiating with the Israelis and the Palestinians for Oslo. And that was supposed to be enacted by the end of '95, and none of it's all gone belly up. You know, and so first of all, you have to basically maintain hope and persistence. And you have to somehow keep trying to challenge the thought patterns and what you see on television and realize that everybody's got an agenda, including myself. But I don't want to keep talking and talking and talking. But the big thing is I'm passionate about this, okay? I've been involved in it since 1977. And I was an international relations course guy in my senior year in high school in the '67 war. So this has been the center of my universe, at least since '77, if not '67. And, you know, my dream is that people could live in peace, but it doesn't seem to happen because we're all locked into our personal interests and prejudices. So if you want, this is something I do sometimes. The Lamb of God, which ends in peace, grant us peace. We all know that the peace in Hebrew is shalom, and we know what it is in probably German and French and Spanish and whatever other language. But I like every once in a while when it comes to something like this to end with the Lamb of God, because, and I'm going to chant it with a certain Arab hymn, because it ends in peace, give us peace. So let me end with that, and that'll be it. Ya Hamillallah Elham al-Khatay al-Alam Irhamna. Ya Hamillallah Elham al-Khatay al-Alam Irhamna. Ya Hamillallah Elham al-Khatay al-Alam Nahna as-Salam. Thanks.
Father Doug, thank you on behalf of all of us. Thank you very much. This is very powerful, very thought-provoking, and we appreciate your enthusiasm and passion for justice and peace in the Middle East. So thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you all. Bye-bye.
God bless
Bye-bye.
you. God
Thank
bless.
you.